Here's the thing, nobody on cable news wants to say out loud, Russia is losing, not spinning its wheels, not stalling, losing, and it's happening fast enough now that even the Kremlin's own military bloggers can't cover for it anymore. On May 15, 2026, a Ukrainian brigade walked into a village that Russia had occupied for 6 months, and they cleared it in a single day. 6 months of occupation. One day to end it that should be screaming from every front page in America. Instead, it's buried under noise. So I'm going to tell you what actually happened, why it matters, and what it tells us about the direction this war is heading. Because the story of Russia's collapsing war machine is one of the most consequential stories of our time, and the people who should be telling it clearly are dropping the ball. This is about Putin's war machine breaking down in real time, about a military superpower that bet everything on brute force and is discovering that brute force has an expiration date. And right now, in the spring of 2026, that date is arriving. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit that button. This channel doesn't soften the story for comfort. We tell you what's actually happening, and what's happening right now deserves your full attention. Let's start with a small village in northeastern Kharkiv Oblast called Odradna. You probably haven't heard of it. That's part of the problem. Russia occupied Odradna back in November 2025, and for the months that followed, the Kremlin used it like a chess piece, a hook on their strategic map, a pressure point designed to squeeze Ukrainian forces near Kupiansk and accelerate their push toward the Oskil River and anchor their entire northeastern advance. This wasn't just some random village. In Moscow's operational planning, Odradna was load-bearing. It was a linchpin in the Russian military's stated goal of dominating the eastern Kharkiv and northern Donetsk regions. They needed it. They built around it. They defended it. And then, on May 15, 2026, Ukraine's 129th Independent Heavy Mechanized Brigade showed up and erased it from Russia's strategic map in a single day. But the way they did it, that's where the real story lives. This wasn't a frontal charge. This wasn't a mass infantry push where Ukraine threw bodies at a defensive line and hoped something broke through. This was a precisely orchestrated three-phase combined arms operation that looked less like a conventional military assault and more like a surgical dismantling. Phase 1. The Rugby Team Unmanned Systems Battalion sent reconnaissance and attack drones into the area and methodically mapped every single Russian position, shelters hidden in forested areas, fortified firing points, command nodes, troop concentrations, all of it photographed, cataloged, and tagged at the same time. Ukrainian electronic warfare units were jamming Russian drones. They didn't just attack, they blinded the enemy first. Russia couldn't see what was coming. Phase 2 hit like a hammer. Once every target was mapped, artillery units and loitering munitions went to work with precision fire. Russian firing positions got hit, supply lines got cut, shelters got struck. And this wasn't random bombardment. It was a systematic destruction of the defensive architecture Russia had spent months building. By the time Phase 2 was finished, the Russian defense in Odradna wasn't weakened. It was gutted. Phase 3 was almost clinical. Mechanized infantry groups, supported by armored vehicles, pushed through the forested areas and dislodged whatever Russian soldiers remained. What the Deep State Open Source Intelligence Group reported afterward was stark in its understatement. New tactics are yielding results. That's a polite way of saying that Russia's defense didn't just lose, it collapsed. According to the 16th Army Corps' own statements, 56 Russian soldiers were neutralized. Others abandoned their positions outright and ran. Footage of the retreat was shared on Russian military blogger channels, not Ukrainian propaganda, Russian channels, 6 months of occupation, 1 day to dismantle it, and the soldiers who were supposed to hold it fled on video for the whole world to see. This is what military collapse looks like before it becomes a rout. You don't always see the breaking point in real time, but when the defenders are filming their own retreat and posting it online, you're watching history happen. Odradna is not just a village. It is a data point in a pattern that is becoming impossible to deny. Now, here's what the Odradna operation actually represents in the larger context of this war, and why dismissing it as a small tactical gain misses the entire point. Ukraine's 129th Brigade didn't just retake Odradna. They cleared the surrounding forested areas, the fortified positions, the strong points. They liberated roughly 22 square kilometers of territory in a single operation. And this wasn't their first rodeo on this particular line. In April 2026, the same brigade retook the village of Ambin and cleared approximately 5.7 square kilometers around it. That means this single Ukrainian unit has now systematically dismantled 2 major Russian positions along the Kupiansk-Vadov line in the span of weeks. This is not improvisation. This is a deliberate, methodical campaign to break Russia's strategic backbone in this region. That backbone, the line stretching from Ambin to Odradna, was the foundation of Russia's plan to reach the Oskil River. It was the operational axis Moscow needed to maintain pressure, force Ukrainian repositioning, and eventually punch through to a strategic objective that would have given them enormous leverage over northeastern Ukraine. Ukraine didn't just defend against that plan. Ukraine broke it. They identified the spine of the Russian operations design and snapped it, segment by segment, with a combat model that is now becoming Ukraine's signature. Drones map it, artillery kills it, infantry clears it. And the efficiency of that cycle is accelerating. What's happening around Sviatove reinforces this picture further. On May 12th, the villages of Herka, Karmasinivka, and Kobalivka all came under Ukrainian control in the direction of Sviatove. These settlements sit on the western flank of the final defensive line Russia held after its forced withdrawal in the fall of 2022. That was the line Russia was supposed to hold indefinitely. The fall of Herka is particularly significant because it doesn't just represent territory recovered, it opens a potential corridor for a large-scale Ukrainian advance toward Borova. Elements of the 14th and 92nd Mechanized Brigades, along with National Guard units, are operating in this area, and they're using the same model that took Odradna apart. Fog operations, night assaults, small agile groups with drone overwatch. Ukraine is exploiting every environmental variable, low visibility, terrain features, the physical and psychological exhaustion of Russian defenders, and turning them into offensive advantages. South of Krylyivka, Russian forces are being pushed back from a railway junction they've been trying to recapture for months. The pressure is breaking them there too. Russia's plan to reach the Oskil River, a plan they have been prosecuting for over 3 years, at enormous cost in blood and material, is, in the blunt words of every serious analyst watching this theater, losing touch with reality. This is what strategic failure looks like when it's happening in slow motion. The Kremlin told its people, told its military, told the world that the Northeast was under control, that Ukraine was losing ground, that the inevitable Russian advance was only a matter of time, and now, village by village, tree line by tree line, Ukraine is dismantling that narrative with documented operations, verified footage, and coordinates that don't lie. But the Northeast isn't the only place where Russia's war plan is unraveling. Let's go north for a moment, just above the Kupiansk-Vadov line, because what's happening near Vovchansk is just as important and even less reported. Ukraine's 23rd Assault Battalion punched through the Russian defensive line near Vovchansk between April and May of this year, liberated the village of Storytsia, and pushed into the forested area north of the Bar settlement. Think about what that means geographically. Those forests sit 4 to 5 kilometers from the Russian border. Ukraine is fighting in territory that Russia considered permanently secured. Those trees, every one of them a potential shelter, every thicket a potential ambush site. Russia had counted on those forests as a natural fortress, a zone where defenders had all the advantage. Ukraine went in anyway and drove them out from inside it. During this same period, Bilcha was cleared, and positions southeast of Volchansk were recaptured. Russia had concentrated serious firepower in this region, the 69th Motorized Infantry Division, Akhmat Chechen units, a formidable defensive grouping by any measure, and Ukraine pushed them into a defensive crouch anyway. The buffer zone that Russia was trying to maintain, the strategic cushion that was supposed to protect its border regions from Ukrainian pressure has evaporated. Now shift south to what is arguably the most intense grinder in the entire conflict right now, the Pokrovsk sector in Donetsk. Russia has reportedly massed between 60,000 and 80,000 troops here. 60 to 80,000 soldiers concentrated on a single operational axis. Moscow is trying to encircle Kostyantynivka, establish footholds in Mirnorod, and create conditions for an advance toward Kramatorsk, one of the major urban centers that would represent a genuinely significant strategic gain. On May 17th alone, 32 separate clashes took place in the Pokrovsk sector, 32 engagements in a single day, and the front line barely moved. Russia has thrown an enormous force at this objective, is sustaining catastrophic losses to maintain pressure, and is watching its assault waves get torn apart by Ukrainian drone, superiority, and rapid counterattack cycles. Ukraine's 7th Rapid Reaction Corps is operating in this area, and the model is consistent. Strike Russian logistics with medium-range drones to starve the assault of ammunition and fuel, then repel the actual infantry pushes with swift, calculated counterattacks that hit Russian units when they're most exposed. The result is that Russian forces in this sector have been forced to abandon armored vehicle movement almost entirely in certain areas. They're using motorcycles, trailers, low-profile vehicles that present smaller signatures to drone sensors. Ask yourself what that means for combat effectiveness. You're talking about a military that built its entire tactical doctrine around armored assault, now reduced to moving troops and supplies on motorcycles because armored vehicles are just expensive targets for cheap drones. That's not an adaptation. That's a degradation. And further west, along the Sloviansk-Kostiantynivka axis, Ukraine is grinding out small but consistent gains there too. Every axis tells the same story. Russia attacks, Russia pays, Russia doesn't break through. Now let's go south, because if you think the Northeast is bad for Russia, the Zaporizhia front might be the most devastating part of this entire picture. Since January 2026, Ukraine has recaptured approximately 65 square kilometers of territory in this region. When you include the broader operational area, that figure exceeds 400 square kilometers recovered. 400 square kilometers. In a war where both sides have spent years fighting for individual tree lines, that number is staggering. Russia has thrown some of its most elite formations at this front: the 7th, 98th, and 104th Airborne Divisions. These are not conscript units. These are the tip of Russia's spear forces that represent the best of what the Russian military can put in the field. They've been concentrated under the 58th Combined Arms Army alongside motorized infantry divisions in what amounts to a massive consolidation of elite combat power. And it hasn't worked. On May 17th, Russian forces launched 24 offensive operations in the Huliopol direction and made no meaningful progress on the southern front. None. The elite of the Russian military, concentrated in force, with 7 months of sustained effort behind them, is failing to move the line. Ukraine's tactical response in the south has been almost textbook in its effectiveness. The pattern that analysts are now calling the hold, counter, attack, consolidate cycle has become Ukraine's operational signature in this theater. Russian assault groups push forward, take ground, or push Ukraine back slightly, and before they can consolidate that gain, Ukrainian forces hit them with drones, with artillery, with rapid infantry counterattacks. Russia pays an enormous cost to take a position, and then loses it within hours before they can dig in and defend it. That cycle repeats day after day, week after week, and what it does to an attacking force over time is devastating. It's not just about the territory lost or the casualties taken. It's what it does to unit cohesion, to command confidence, to the morale of men who are being asked to assault fortified positions, knowing that even if they succeed, they'll be hit immediately and driven back. The psychological dimension of this cycle is as important as the tactical one, and Russia is losing on both dimensions simultaneously in the south. The broader picture that emerges when you map all of this together, the northeast, the north, the Donetsk axis. The south is a Russian military that is stuck in a strategic paradox of its own making. They must attack to justify the war. They must show progress to maintain domestic support and the appearance of momentum. But every attack is costing them more than they're gaining. And the tactical environment has shifted enough that even when they take ground, they can't hold it efficiently. April 2026 marked the first month since the Kursk operation in August 2024 that Russia experienced a net loss of territory. Ukraine achieved a net gain of approximately 116 square kilometers in April alone. Over the 30 days leading up to mid-May, Russia lost control of an additional 113 square kilometers. The math is brutal and it's getting worse for Moscow. Before we go deeper into what this means for Russia's long-term capacity to fight this war, I want to pause and ask you something directly. Are you getting coverage like this anywhere else? Coverage that connects the dots, that tells you what the battlefield data actually means, and that doesn't reduce this to a soundbite. If not, subscribe right now, ring the bell. Share this with someone who needs to understand what's really happening. Because this next part is where the story gets truly significant. Let's talk about what Ukraine is doing behind the front lines, because this is perhaps the most underreported dimension of the entire conflict, and it's changing the strategic calculus in ways that will reverberate far beyond this war. In March 2026, for the first time in the entire conflict, Ukraine surpassed Russia in the total number of long-range drone attacks launched. Read that again. The country that has been fighting a defensive war against a nuclear superpower's military machine now launches more long-range strikes than its attacker. That's not a tactical footnote. That is a fundamental shift in the nature of this conflict. Approximately 70% of Russian territory is now within range of Ukrainian drones. Targets 2,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border are being struck on a regular basis. The geography of Russian immunity, the assumption that distance from the front line meant safety, is gone. The economic damage being inflicted through these strikes is severe and compounding. Attacks on Russian ports and oil refineries in April forced a reduction in oil production of up to 400,000 barrels per day. Zelensky reported that the ports of Novorossiysk and Ust-Luga, two of Russia's most critical maritime export hubs, are operating at 38% and 43% of their capacity, respectively. Think about what that means for Russia's war funding. Oil revenue is the financial spine of the Russian military effort. Every refinery that burns, every tanker that can't load, every port operating at half capacity is a direct subtraction from Russia's ability to pay for this war. And Ukraine isn't just hitting energy infrastructure. On the night of May 16th, the Nevonomysk Azot chemical plant in the Stavropol region was struck by long-range drones and caught a major fire. This facility is one of Russia's largest producers of ammonium nitrate, a direct precursor to explosive manufacturing. Ukraine isn't just degrading Russia's ability to fight today, it's destroying the industrial inputs that feed tomorrow's munitions. The reach of these strikes has become genuinely extraordinary. Su-57 and Su-34 aircraft at the Shagol airfield in Chelyabinsk, 1,700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, were hit by drones. A Karakurt-class missile ship capable of launching Kalib cruise missiles was targeted at the Primorsk port, Mariupol, which Russia has controlled since 2022 and considered secure rear territory, is being patrolled by Azov Corps drones operating 160 kilometers behind the front lines. Crimea, the symbolic crown jewel of Russia's 2014 land grab, is under regular fire. The M14 highway, the main land corridor connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland, is being struck. The Dyshenkoy rail station has come under attack. There is no safe rear area left in Russian-controlled territory. The drone engagement zone that once extended maybe a few kilometers from the front line has now swallowed the entire operational theater and is reaching into Russia proper. This creates an asymmetric nightmare for the attacking side. Russia, as the force on offense, must constantly move troops, ammunition, fuel, and equipment forward toward the front. Every convoy, every supply depot, every maintenance facility is exposed to drone attack. Ukraine, primarily on defense, can sustain its fighting capacity while systematically attacking Russia's ability to sustain its own, destroying the logistics chain that turns Russian industrial production into battlefield combat power. The drone war has fundamentally altered the economics of this conflict, and right now, those economics favor the defender. All of that battlefield pressure and strategic degradation feeds directly into what may be Russia's most acute and irreversible crisis, its manpower problem. In the first 4 months of 2026, Russian losses reached nearly 130,000 dead and are wounded. Over 70,000 of those casualties came in March and April alone, 2 months. To put that in context for American audiences, the United States lost approximately 58,000 soldiers over the entire course of the Vietnam War. Russia is losing that scale of human capital in roughly 2 months of fighting in 2026. And the most critical data point in this entire analysis is this: Russia can no longer replace the soldiers it's losing at the rate it's losing them. Medvedev publicly claimed that 27,000 contract soldiers are being recruited monthly, but independent researchers in Germany have determined that Russian losses run at approximately 35,000 per month. That is a structural deficit. Every single month, Russia fields fewer combat-ready soldiers than it had the month before, and the recruitment environment is deteriorating rapidly. Russian regions are offering signing bonuses worth tens of thousands of dollars, extraordinary sums in the Russian economic context, and recruitment is still slowing down. It's down 20% compared to previous periods, when the average survival time near the front lines is measured in weeks. Financial incentives lose their persuasive power. You can't spend a signing bonus if you're dead inside of a month. What's changed isn't just the numbers, it's the nature of how Russian soldiers are dying. For most of modern military history, wars produce roughly 2 to 3 wounded soldiers for every 1 killed. That ratio reflects the capacity of modern medicine, evacuation procedures, and protective equipment to convert what would have been fatalities into survivable injuries. By that standard, Russia's kill-to-wound ratio was already poor. But by March 2026, Zelensky was reporting that Russia was suffering nearly 2 deaths for every single wounded soldier. That ratio has flipped in the most catastrophic direction possible. The reason is FPV drones. Approximately 80% of Russian casualties are now being caused by first-person view kamikaze drones, small, fast, nearly silent, and guided with artificial intelligence via fiber optic cables that electronic warfare systems cannot jam. Russian soldiers report that they never hear these drones until the moment of impact. There is no warning. There is no time to take cover. The drone arrives and detonates. And because FPV drones deliver their entire explosive payload in a direct strike, the casualty patterns are far more lethal than artillery fragmentation. And when a soldier is wounded by an FPV drone in the field, medical evacuation has become so dangerous because the evacuation vehicles themselves become drone targets that wounded soldiers are frequently left on the battlefield. The kill-to-wound ratio isn't just reflecting lethality, it's reflecting abandonment. And the director of a Russian drone development facility wrote explicitly in early April, "We have lost our lead over the past 6 months." That admission should have been front-page news everywhere. A Russian defense industry insider acknowledging that Ukraine now holds the technological edge in the weapons system that is defining this war. 90% of Russian losses in Donetsk, he noted, are occurring in what he called last mile logistics, the final movement of supplies from staging areas to frontline positions. Russia has been forced to limit convoys to 2 trucks at a time to reduce aerial detection signatures. 2 trucks. That is not a military logistics system, that is survival behavior. So what does all of this mean for where this war goes from here? And more importantly, what does it mean for the decisions that need to be made in Washington, in Brussels, in every capital that has a stake in the outcome? Because this war doesn't end in a vacuum, and the implications for American security, for NATO's credibility, for the global order are enormous. Let's start with Putin himself, because the man at the center of this catastrophe is running out of moves, and the world needs to understand that clearly. His options have been narrowing for months and are now approaching something close to exhaustion. Full mobilization, drafting the Russian population at scale, would be political suicide. The partial mobilization of 2022 triggered mass protests and an exodus of hundreds of thousands of military-age Russian men leaving the country. A full mobilization in 2026, after 3 years of grinding losses and with domestic morale in visible decline, would risk destabilizing the regime itself. Putin knows this. That is why he hasn't done it. The nuclear threat has been his most used diplomatic weapon throughout this conflict, but it is losing its edge with every passing month. 4 years of explicit and implicit nuclear messaging without action has eroded its deterrent value. The West has tested the limits repeatedly, providing heavier weapons, longer-range systems, and intelligence support without triggering the nuclear response Putin implied was certain. Each time the red line moved and nothing happened, the threat lost credibility. It's not gone. A nuclear-armed Russia always demands serious attention, but it no longer commands the paralytic fear it once did in Western capitals. Using Belarus as a second front is another option that looks more dangerous than useful. Lukashenko has declared selective mobilization, but the Belarusian army has virtually no combat experience. The country's military readiness is minimal, and the regime still carries the structural fragility of the 2020 protests that nearly toppled it. Deploying Belarusian forces into Ukraine could expose that fragility in catastrophic ways, and any significant Belarusian military action risks triggering direct NATO responses that Putin cannot afford to provoke, shifting Russia's economy even further into war mode, which Putin has already done to a significant degree, threatens to collapse a budget already operating under enormous strain from sanctions, capital flight, and the energy revenue degradation that Ukraine's drone campaign is accelerating. The Russian economy is not infinite, and the war is consuming it faster than oil revenues at current suppressed levels can replace. On the international stage, Putin's allies are offering words, not weapons. China and India continue to provide diplomatic cover, purchasing Russian energy and blocking Western resolutions in multilateral forums. But Beijing has been explicit about not wanting to be caught supplying arms to a losing military adventure. Delhi is buying cheap Russian oil at a discount and maintaining political distance. Neither ally is willing to share the actual cost of this war, which means Putin is carrying it alone. The EU's foreign policy chief said recently that Putin has never been in a weaker position. That statement from a European diplomat would have been unthinkable in 2022. The gap between where Russia started this invasion and where it finds itself in May 2026 is a measure of strategic failure that history will record harshly. The uncomfortable truth that the Kremlin is being forced to confront, and that the rest of the world needs to confront with it, is that wars of attrition have a simple, brutal logic. They are won by the side that can sustain losses longer than the other for 3 years. The conventional wisdom was that Russia, with its larger population, larger economy, and nuclear arsenal, was the side with greater endurance. That assumption is cracking, not because Ukraine has become a superpower, but because Ukraine has refused to break. It has adapted, innovated, and found ways to fight that, exploit every Russian vulnerability, doctrinal rigidity, logistical dependence on long supply chains, the strategic liability of being the attacking force in a drone-saturated battlefield, the numbers that matter, casualties per square kilometer gained, territory lost per month, recruitment rates versus loss rates, the kill-to-wound ratio, the percentage of oil infrastructure disabled, all of them are trending in one direction. And that direction is not toward Russian victory. The battle for Odrodna was one village, one operation, one day. But it is a window into what this war has become in 2026. It is a war where Russia is spending blood and treasure it cannot replace in pursuit of objectives it cannot reach, with a military doctrine that the battlefield has rendered obsolete, against an opponent that has refused every opportunity to collapse. The villages have names most Americans can't pronounce. The stakes could not be higher. And the story of how Ukraine is winning, methodically, tactically, at tremendous cost, but with increasing clarity, deserves to be told with the full force it demands. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Because what happens in those villages, in Odrodna, in Vovchansk, in the steppes of Zaporizhia, shapes the world your children will inherit. This is the story that matters, and we're going to keep telling it.